days with an angel on earth I found worthless. Saving dollars on a rock in space, I won't kill for gold. No, no one can tell me that it's over. I know you came back from the grave, and I own nothing if it pulls me away. You give me life, Lord, hey. You give me life, now I've got purpose. Oh, I feel love.
And we're live.
We're live.
Just like that.
Nice.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 8 of...
The Q Show.
I have to, make some echoey sound or something like that.
You just like doing the deep voice.
Yeah, I just don't have a deep enough voice to pull it off.
All right. Man, well, this will be fun today.
Oh, yeah. There's no way we'll hear anything back on the gear page about this.
Yeah.
This will, well, it's a topic of some... the amount of drama in the world over digital products entering into the domain of...
and we're about to contribute to that.
That's not a bad thing, though. It's
No.
a debate for good reason, and that there's never a problem, at least in my mind, with that. I kind of enjoy the debate itself.
So, yeah.
With that said, let's go back in time, buddy.
Let's do it. So, yeah. So just to, I guess, to give
How do you
everybody
frame
high
this
level
conversation?
exactly.
In case you think we think these things through heavily right before
we
before we do them, no.
Yeah. Look, I made a lot of notes, but Chris doesn't know any of this.
Oh,
so
man.
this is going to be a surprise.
Uh-oh.
Well, you know some
I'm
of
in
this,
trouble. I'm in trouble.
But he's not seen any of my notes. So this is going to be fun. So we've gotten a lot of questions about, some questions about what we mean by the anti-modeler concept. And so we wanted to take this episode to to try to explain what we mean by that, but also to provide some historical perspective.
Well, you kind of have to frame the conversation, because first off, what is modeling? I could ask 20 people, and 20 people will give me 20 answers. And even if you were to ask developers, if you were asked to ask the manufacturers, you're going to get, again, 20 different answers.
Right.
Because it kind of means something to everyone. So it's become kind of a generic term, at least I think.
Yeah, you're reading my mind here.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the first things.
Well, I'll shut up then. You go, buddy.
But, I wanted to start off by saying that so a lot of what I wanted to talk about is just my perspective of what's happened over the past 30 years that I've been doing this. I'm not like a gear historian,
Right.
Who knows all the details of all the relevant products. These are just my opinions, okay? So you take it for what you will. What I am going to start off by saying is that the idea that the tube amp is the gold standard is a myth.
And he goes straight for the jugular.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially it's a lie promoted by gear manufacturers who want to sell you a more expensive piece of gear. Okay?
Yep.
There have been a lot of examples of great sounding amps that were not tube amps.
We sell a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely.
So look, if you prefer the sound of a tube amp, that's fine. Look, it's a subjective thing. I'm not here to say that one thing sounds better than another. I want to push back against the idea that tubes are the gold standard. and that everything needs to conform to that.
Yeah, some of the, historically speaking, some of the biggest hits, I mean, going back through really kind of back to the beginning of guitar, it wasn't always a tube amp that did it.
Right.
It's and something that Pat always says, which I find to be kind of astonishingly true, and this is one of the things that I think is kind of lost on folks, is, and maybe Pat has that unique perspective because he went through it, but he says, history just kind of wrote out all the bad tube amps. There were a lot. There were a lot of amps that just kind of didn't go the distance, didn't sound very good, weren't very well designed or put together, and so it's not having that perspective and not having that shift for a lot of musicians. You get this, and I remember doing this in the early days of Quilter Labs. I would walk into a music store. I won't mention any names, but. But I remember them. I'd walk in and I'd tell them, "Oh, I have this amplifier," and they're like, "Is it tube or solid state?"
Yeah.
And so, quickly I realized I have to kind of make a third island, to live on. There's solid state and there's tube. And actually, I agree, solid state kind of sucks, in terms of when you're trying to dial in kind of a great tone, when you're trying to get something that has warmth and life to it. I agree that if you take something that is really a solid state, by definition, that high damping factor, low damping factor, high output impedance. My head this morning. If you get a true solid state amplifier, it doesn't really sound that good. You can crank up distortion, quote unquote, but it just sounds fizzy, thin, awful,
Well, I mean, I think you'd be surprised to learn that a lot of the stuff that you heard in recordings,
right,
that you might have just assumed was a tube amp.
Yep.
There are a lot of examples where it wasn't.
Def
Where it
Leppard,
was a solid state device, which I have some examples of that, and there are many, and we're just I just wrote down a few, which we'll get to in a minute. But before we get too deep into this, I wanted to kind of define some terminology.
Oh, good.
Because there are a lot of words that get thrown around and confused with one another and often used interchangeably. And there are subtle differences and not so subtle differences. And so what I mean is words like emulation, simulation, modeling, and now, we have profiling.
Right.
And so I just wanted to say how I would define these terms.
Okay.
And so that as we talk about this more.
Well, that's useful. Then you can know what folks can know what you're talking about specifically. Yeah.
Right. And you'll also see how. I should also say that there are differences from a technical perspective, and then there's the marketing perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me say what I mean by these first, and we'll get into that. So, emulation versus simulation. So really what we're talking about in context of a guitar amp is trying to recreate the tone or sound of that amp,
right,
or replicate it. And the way I would describe emulation versus simulation is emulation is kind of getting the feel of that amp or certain aspects of that amp, trying to recreate that.
Right.
Whereas simulation is a little more exacting, like you're trying to get it more precisely replicate the sound of that. So it's just it's a difference of one is a little more exacting than the other. That's the way I would describe those two. Now, if those two terms get interchanged, I don't really care about that too much. It's the difference is subtle, but if you want to be precise about it, then I'd say emulation is a little more softer of a term than simulation. Now,
They've always been kind of interchangeable in my head, but
Yeah.
I'm with you on this.
Yeah.
I see.
and if that's the way you want to use it, then, like I said, I don't really have a problem with that because I think the difference here is kind of subtle. Now, modeling. So modeling is essentially a marketing term, okay, invented by Line 6. It didn't exist prior to the first Line 6 amp.
Right.
And the way I would describe that is that you're taking an amplifier at the component level
Right.
or the sub-circuit level and emulating or simulating those and then putting it together.
Right.
Okay, so it's an emulation or simulation of an amplifier at the component or sub-circuit level.
Gotcha.
Okay, and then profiling is a more recent phrase, and we're not really going to talk about that today too much. But if you want to know how I would define that, as opposed to modeling, and
Right.
again, these terms modeling and profiling.
Again, for me, it's the same thing.
These are just processes
Right.
by which you simulate or emulate an amplifier. Okay? So they're not they're somewhat independent, right?
Right.
They're not mutually exclusive. Okay? It's just that, a model is a way of simulating or emulating an amp.
Right.
Okay? Profile is a little different way of doing it, and it may involve modeling, but essentially you are looking at the input and output of the amp and adapting an algorithm.
Well, really, you're just telling the DSP what to do to
Well,
try
you're-
to achieve the same function.
Right. You're
Yeah.
adapting the algorithm to achieve the same output given
Right.
the same input. So it's just it's a little different process
Yeah.
to achieve a similar result.
Right.
Okay, but like I said, we're not really going to get into that today, or at least I hadn't planned to.
You never know.
And then, market, as far as marketing goes, like these things get thrown around a lot. And so you can't put too much weight on what a marketing person says if something's, a simulation versus an emulation versus
Right.
whatever.
That doesn't really, just because you call it something doesn't get to the nuts and bolts of what's actually happening under the hood.
Right.
Yeah. And at the end of the
Yeah.
day, in terms of just achieving results, that kind of is key. Is
Yeah.
what's happening matters.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, in the old days, before
When we were kids.
well, even before we were kids, I mean, and look, Pat knows this probably better than we
Right.
do. But in the old days, there were only two amps, and amps were really just initially made to make a guitar louder.
Right.
So the fact that they would distort when you crank them up was like not initially, it was not an intended effect.
Right.
But people will learn that, like, hey, this kind of sounds cool.
Yeah.
And so some of the gear manufacturers figured out, okay, well, let's make it sound better when it distorts.
Right.
It just so happened that they were tube amps. That was just the first.
Well, yeah. If there was if there were solid state implementations prior to that, the world might have been very different.
Well, solid state didn't exist commercially.
Yeah.
In
Because this is the
like,
40s,
right.
Yeah, back in Hawaii, lap steel players realized they could, be louder than the boisterous nightclubs of Honolulu if they played through, a magnetic pickup into something that would amplify that sound. And prior to that, that's kind of where the tricone came in, if we go back far enough. And I only say this because I've heard Pat tell the story. But, that was kind of the advent or the reason, to even have this. I mean, in fact, these technological shifts are part of what reshaped music itself, because it was a prior to that, in order to have a dance, you had to have a band, enough musicians to make enough noise to get the thing going. And so this was kind of a technological shift that we went from having to have a big orchestra or band down to being able to do this with a 3 or 4 piece, because now we're loud enough now, is the idea.
Yeah.
But rolling forward from there, to your point, that's where, I think I always want to trace it back to Marshall, Jim Marshall, and, because he basically kind of invented the real first rock amplifier, whereas we have Leo Fender on the other side of the ocean, scooping the mids and doing everything he can to keep Dick Dale from going into, distortion.
Right. Yeah.
So, which didn't work.
Yeah. And look, by the time I was, playing, which would be like in the 80s, and we're around the same age, so it's probably around the same time as you. I mean, by that time, the distortion characteristic of the guitar sound was prevalent.
Yeah.
And so growing up, that's kind of the thing that we strived to perfect.
Right. And definitely the sound we wanted to achieve,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really where my story kind of starts, is during the 80s.
Yeah.
When I started playing, and then started playing in a band and gigging. And, I grew up in a very middle-class family in the Midwest. And most of the other musicians I knew were similar.
Right.
And the vast majority of us had solid state amps because that's what we could afford.
Well, and if that's what you can afford, that's what you get,
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if you go to a music store, that's just what was common because, the fact is that a lot of people just couldn't afford a high-end tube amp.
Right.
And so, and most of the musicians I saw, they, played with a solid state amp.
And then price-wise, back in the day, a really good tube amp, $500-600 back in the 80s, easily, if not more.
Probably more than that. Yeah.
But, we look at kind of the comparative to the time. We look to today, and to get a good one, it's $5,000-6,000.
Yeah.
So there's been so many economical shifts, so many technological shifts and whatnot.
And there's the practical aspects of a solid state amp versus a tube amp. They're just, they're lighter.
Right.
They are more reliable. You don't have the microphonics problem.
Right.
So if you are gigging, it's just, it makes more sense.
Right.
For a lot of reasons. And, the few people that I would see that were playing through a tube amp, either somebody in another band or whatever, a lot of times it didn't sound that great. And I'm not saying that's because of the amp. What I'm saying is a lot of times how good a guitarist sounded had more to do with how well they knew how to use the gear.
Right.
Not the gear itself.
That's still true today.
That really exactly.
Nothing's changed.
That's really the big factor, is how well can you use this piece of gear, not the piece of gear itself.
Right. Yeah. In a unique position just because of the nature of the folks I run into, but sometimes it would surprise you how, some people who honestly you'd be like, oh yeah, sure, this guy can play, or gal or whatever. They'll come in and they're just incredible through anything.
Yeah.
And then you get the people that are sometimes big names and come in and just don't know how to get anything out of the gear.
Yeah.
And it surprises you a little because, it's.
So this was all, again, this is like late 80s, early 90s. This is all before the term amp modeling was coined.
Right.
And there were some gear manufacturers who were trying to make things that kind of emulated the tube sound, but there were also gear manufacturers making things that were just their own thing. Like they weren't really trying to emulate a tube per se. They were just
Right.
trying to sound good. And so I have a few examples of that I think might be fun to talk about. The first one, this is probably the most obvious, is the Scholes Rockman, which came out in '82. And so we didn't know this at the time because I think, this kind of information just, we didn't have the internet, so this kind of information just wasn't as readily available. But also, a lot of artists didn't like to divulge what they used when they
Right.
recorded because they wanted to keep their sound. They wanted to have their own sound and didn't want other people knowing that.
Right.
But a lot of people use the Rockman when recording, and so obviously, Tom Scholes used it on the Boston stuff.
It became rather prevalent at one point
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
So obviously Tom Scholes on the Boston albums, but also Def Leppard on the Hysteria album. The Rockman was used, like I don't know, something like 99% of the time or something for almost all the guitar parts.
Right.
ZZ Top, the Eliminator album.
Actually, I had no idea on that one.
I only learned that recently.
That's nuts.
And once I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, like I hear it now.
Oh my gosh, I have to now. I know what I'm listening to today. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
Here's another one I didn't know about was Joe Satriani, Surfing with the Alien. He used it for certain parts in that album, which I knew that he used a lot of different processors and stuff, not like
Right.
conventional amps. But I didn't realize that one of those things was the Rockman. But again, now that I hear that, it's like okay, I can kind of probably hear that. And then also Huey Lewis and the News on the Sports album that was
Wow.
used.
That kind of came to define an era, the Rockman.
Yeah, I mean that was this '80s guitar sound.
Right.
I mean, and there were a lot of other examples. So that's just a few. So when I was looking up like some various albums that it was used on, I ran across this article in ultimateguitar.com, and the quote is that the Rockman was arguably the first widespread example of an amp modeler. And
Which
I'm
wouldn't
like,
really
what?
meet the
What are you talking
wouldn't
about?
meet the definition. Yeah.
First of all, that term had not even been coined yet. And also, like, what do you think modeler means? Like, this is the problem I'm talking about. Like, people throw it around and without knowing what it means. And
Yeah.
so my question is, like, what do you think that term means? And I wonder if what they actually mean is anything that's not an amp.
And that could be the case.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of hard to say. It just depends really on who's saying it, what they're saying it about. But in this case, he's turned a Rockman into the first modeler.
Right. And so
But
I
it wasn't
understand-
modeling anything. It was a new sound.
Exactly. So yeah. So, and I've actually studied the circuits for the Rockman just because I'm curious. And it in no way is what I would call an emulation or simulation of a guitar amp.
Right.
I mean, there are some weird things about what Tom Scholes did in that. I mean, weird and brilliant. Like, because it's obvious that he was just experimenting with stuff until he got something that he liked the sound of.
That's just really cool. There's something very cool about, imagining Tom Schultz in his basement, late at night, building
Yeah.
the future, a future sound.
Yeah. So I kind of understand some of the confusion around the term anti-modeler, because when you think everything's a modeler,
Well,
what does an anti-modeler mean? And so, the first thing that we would say is, well, not everything is a modeler.
Right.
There was a time when people were making things just because they sounded cool, not because they
or
were
at least
trying,
sounded different.
or sounded different.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to emulate an amp. It was just,
Right.
they were trying to make something different and cool. And the Rockman, I think, is probably the best example of that because of when it came out and because it was essentially replacing the entire guitar amp.
Right.
The preamp section and in the cab section, like everything was in, and even some effects, right? Everything was in one unit.
Right.
And so it was ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
I mean, truly.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
And it also just had its own unique sound.
That, I think, was and it was so ubiquitous. There was a point there where wherever you went.
Yeah. I mean, you could even say it was overused.
Yeah.
Because it was, and so I knew people who didn't like it because the sound was fairly distinct and they just didn't want to sound like everybody else, and everybody else was using it.
Right. I mean, it did get to a point where, like I say, it was so because it was so cheap. I had
It was
one.
relatively cheap. Yeah.
I don't know if you had one.
I didn't have one, but I did try one. And it had weird things about it because it ran
Right.
off of batteries. And
Gosh, I forgot
it didn't
about
have a lot of adjustability. I think that was probably the main thing that people didn't like about it.
Right.
You just had like a couple of different settings. But it did sound great. And it tended to be a little noisy. But,
Yeah.
look, it was...
The one I had was horrible in terms of that, yeah. But I just played through it with headphones, I think, at the time, and that's all I ever did. So, yeah. And I mean, for me, just trying to be, I don't know, Angus Young on my Rockman, which, no, that's probably not how that's achieved. But, I'm just trying to have distortion and have some fun with it. And that was, I hate to say, almost like a toy for me back then as a kid. I don't think I ever used it to play live anywhere, ever. Because it was just a toy.
Yeah.
To me, anyway.
Yeah, it was. I don't know. I don't think I knew anybody who used one live.
And I don't think the world was really ready for that at the time. PA systems are ubiquitous now, whereas back then, someone with a PA, wow.
Well, yeah, and if you did have a PA, you were kind of reserving it for the things that weren't amplified.
Right.
Right, like the vocals.
It was a different way of thinking.
You might put a little bit of the guitar through, but you were relying on the guitar amps.
Yeah.
But back to some examples of things that were not tube amps, but still sounded great.
Right.
Okay. Look, and there are many, many examples of this, and I'm just gonna talk about the things that I kind of know something about. And so the next thing I want to mention were crate amps, because I have a history with crate.
This is cool, and I only know a little bit about this. I'm kind of dying to know the story here.
I'll talk about that a little more in a bit, but I just really wanted to mention that, some of that crate amps actually did some pretty cool stuff, and a lot of people think of them as kind of like just a cheap guitar amp.
Right.
But they actually had some fairly high profile artists who use that gear.
Right.
And I'm not talking about like their cheap practice amps. I think that's what a lot of people think about when you hear of like the crate amps. But they had some higher end combo amps and head units. Now they also made a line of tube amps, and those sounded great, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the solid state stuff that they did.
Which I think was my first amp, was a little crate practice amp.
That was my first amp as well, but it was one of the lower end ones and didn't sound that great. But
me too.
their sort of middle range and higher end stuff actually sounded great. And so a couple artists here that use crate. Apparently Sting used crate amps for some of the clean stuff, which they did. They could make some pretty cool clean tones. Sammy Hagar was a well-known user of crate amps, and I remember,
Actual solid state crate amps?
yes, and just a little side story here. So Crate would make custom red Tolex cabinets
Right.
for Sammy, right? Because he's the Red Rocker.
Right.
And, for his tour, they would make a bunch of these cabs that were just dummy cabs. They had no speakers in them.
Right.
And they would, Sammy would stack up behind the stage.
Right.
And so when you see that kind of stuff, like in videos or when artists performed in the 80s, that was all fake, right? It was just for show. Like they weren't using these cabs. One of them might have speakers.
This
in
is
it.
where that all
Yeah.
originated. We all know about it now, but
Yeah, it's just a kind of an entertaining story. But he was a well-known user of Crate products. And then another one I didn't actually know about until recently, CC DeVille of Poison. So I don't know if you remember. I mean, you remember Poison, of course, but that guitar sound that he had, that really thick, like juicy guitar tone,
right.
that was a Crate amp.
That's
which
kind of hard to
apparently
believe, actually.
Apparently, he used that like on everything. And it was sort of his signature sound.
Wow.
And now that I listen to some of that stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what I remember the Crate amp sounding like.
Right. That's crazy.
So, and that was a completely solid state amp. And they had their own patented circuit that they used, which, again, I'll talk about that a little more in a bit, because right now I just want to stick to some examples of stuff that are not tube amps, but are still pretty cool. So Roland made a processor called the GP8. This was in 1987, and my bandmate, I actually played in a couple bands with him. Chad, I don't know if you're ever going to see this video, but if you do, brother, thanks for watching, and I miss you. Chad used a Roland GP8, and it sounded fantastic.
Right.
So the Roland GP8 was a rack unit, and it just, and Roland owned Boss, right? So it was just Boss pedal circuits.
Right.
That could be switched in and out digitally, and you could set up presets, right, to configure the parameters and switch them in and out.
Right.
But it wasn't trying to be like a simulator or emulator or whatever. It was just basically a pedal board and a rack unit.
Yeah. A good idea, actually, for the day and
Yeah.
age. Yeah.
And so apparently, I Googled this, and there were some well-known people who also used the GP8. Prince was known to tour with one, Adrian Belew, and Nils Lofgren.
Wow.
So
who would have thought?
Another
actually?
cool piece of gear that not a tube amp and not a emulator of any sort.
Well, and yeah.
And then last one. Try to wrap this up.
I remember as we kind of got to the end of the 80s, there would be these enormous racks that guitarists would have.
Yeah, this was sort of the heyday of the rack unit.
Yeah.
And so everything was kind of packaged in a rack unit, and we would use MIDI controllers
Right.
to switch them.
Oh, gosh.
Or they'd come with their own little foot controller. It was great. I don't know.
And I mean, in some cases, this goes on even to today. I've been to on a few tours where, the guitarist Joe Don Rooney is the one I'm thinking of. Right offhand from Rascal Flatts. You go in the back and see all the gear he has back there. It's just, it's an incredible. It's racks, not racks of gear, and it still goes on.
Yeah.
The tradition continues.
So, what I used, at least, once these became available, was a Yamaha GEP 50. These came out in 88, and I started using one in 89. The GEP 50 was the guitar version of the SPX 50, which was kind of a slimmed down version of the SPX 90.
Right.
And it was a guitar effect processor. So it had distortion, and it had reverb and echo and chorus, and you could use various effects together.
Right.
And I think this was one of the first, like, other than like the SPX, Yamaha SPX stuff, it was one of the first units, the fully digital guitar processors.
Right.
And I mean, I thought it sounded great, at least better than the stuff I was using previously.
Right.
By today's standards, maybe it wouldn't hold up that well, but for that time,
For that era, yeah.
it was actually a good sounding piece of gear. And again, fully digital. And I actually went back and downloaded the manual for this to see how they described it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And they just called it a guitar effects processor, and they called the distortion just distortion, never claiming that it's a simulation of a tube amp or anything like that.
Right.
So again, there's this sort of steady progression to developing technology. First solid state, then stuff that was DSP based. And some people were trying to, simulate a tube, but other people were just kind of off doing something else.
Well, and why not?
Yeah.
There was no hard, fast rules. Rockman took over for a while.
Yeah, it was, I mean, the sentiment was, look, if it sounded good, then it is good. And it doesn't matter if it's a tube or not.
Right.
And sure, you had some people who were like, oh, no, I'm only going to use a tube amp. Those people have always existed.
Yeah.
But there were a lot more people who were willing to experiment and try other things.
Right. Well, and that was kind of the nice thing about the 80s and 90s is that's when I remember being in bands, and the guitarists would just kind of generally have a never-ending cascade of interesting new effects processors, usually rack-mounted effects processors. In fact, I remember that's when Marshall kind of started making more, if I recall, rack-mounted amplifiers. So they would run their rack-mounted effects into a rack-mounted amplifier, and then run that, of course, into the cabinets and whatnot.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where it began to transition. So we found ourselves, at least as I recall, sometime in the early to mid 90s, in this kind of a hybridization where you still had maybe a tube and maybe not, because a lot of guitarists still had solid state rack mount amplifiers.
Well, there's a big push during that time toward digital effects.
Right.
And so you didn't really see like digital distortion stuff
Right.
Too much around that period. But you saw a wider proliferation of digital effects.
The Alesis, Microverb, and
Alesis, Lexicon, Digitech. There were
Yamaha. I have one of their delay units in the rack in there.
Yeah, so there was a big push toward building that out, and I think the feeling was that DSP was going to be the next big thing. It's just people were waiting for the hardware capability to get to the point where you could implement the full guitar signal chain.
Right.
Now, Yamaha, they had an advantage over everybody else because they were using custom hardware. And that's why, I believe that's why they were kind of the first to really be able to get more or less a full guitar chain. I mean, they didn't have like the cabinet emulation in there, but they had the other stuff. But they had custom hardware that was kind of built to do this kind of processing. And almost everybody else was relying on off-the-shelf, like commercially available processors, general purpose DSPs. And those are not, so there are certain things that are that require a little more processing to do. Certain types of effects require a little more work to do them in a general purpose DSP.
Right.
And so if you're trying to do the same thing in a general purpose DSP, you just didn't have enough horsepower yet. without it costing a lot of money. So I think people were just kind of trying to make the most out of it. That's why you saw the more, digital effects.
Right.
And I think we all felt like, oh, okay, this is just a matter of time before.
Well, and some of them, I mean, to the GP8, I still recall programming the thing and dialing in distortion. So it was already kind of happening
well,
anyway.
the GP8, so all the processing was analog. It was
Right.
just, you were just switching those in and out.
No, I get it. I'm just.
And there were hybrid processors that would do like Digitech. I think had some hybrid processors where the distortion was analog, but the effects were digital. So we were definitely just moving more in that direction to a fully digital signal chain.
But the ecosystem, again, didn't really exist for everybody because general DSP was probably limited in what it could do relative to, first off, how much horsepower it had.
Yeah.
Secondly, there probably wasn't programming languages to assist people in.
Well, DSP was all done in assembly
In
language
assembly,
in
wow.
those days, and I did everything in assembly. So that's not really a limitation. It's harder.
Well, you
But
have
that's not going to stop anybody.
You got to be pretty brilliant to translate what you're trying to achieve on a DSP to assembly language. For me,
it's just a little more work. That's all it is.
Yeah, I admire that. Yeah, having actually coded in assembly before, I'm kind of terrified.
And so some of the early attempts at doing this, like with the Yamaha GEP50, there were some people, felt like it sounded too sterile or maybe lacked the feel.
Right.
But I think mostly, most people kind of understood that because there's sort of this exponential growth in processing power.
Right.
And that algorithms were continuously improved, that this stuff was going to get resolved, right? And the whole industry was going to shift in this direction at some point.
Right.
Well, and when I say whole industry, look, there's always going to be segments that are going to want tube amps or solid state. But I guess what I'm saying is that the mainstream part of the industry was going to shift more toward that.
Right.
Which ultimately it did, but not in the way that we expected at the time, which I'm getting to that.
We're leading up to something.
We're leading up to that. So in the mid-'90s, after I got out of college, I started working at SLM Electronics, which they made crate amps and Ampeg amps. And as I mentioned, crate actually had some really good sounding solid state amps. And I heard these firsthand, and they were really great and got better and better over time.
Right.
And a lot of this was because of their patented, what they called their flex wave circuit. And in the patent, it claims that it simulates the characteristics of a tube, but I would describe it more as an emulation.
Right.
Because they're really just using solid state technology, not in like a brute force way to simulate a tube, but just using kind of what comes naturally to a certain to the components that you have available to you in a solid state circuit to create something that gave more dynamics and more even harmonics, which are characteristics of a tube gain circuit.
Right.
And I always felt like it was a very creative circuit and a good example of how you would use the technology that you have available to you, and get the most out of it without taking a brute force approach to simulating a tube.
Right.
And I think that kind of had a influence on me, throughout my career, that being able to use what you have available to you, creatively and efficiently to get the most out of it, rather than just saying, okay, I want to simulate this as accurately as possible, and
So let's use
whatever it takes, let's just do that.
let's use a computer processor.
So while I was at SLM, the first couple of years, I'd worked on various projects, but a lot of what I worked on was DSP effect processors.
Right.
So things that did reverbs, delays, choruses.
Right.
A couple of rack mount units, like everything was rack gear in those days.
Yep.
And then we go to NAMM one year. This was in '96. And Line 6 had just come out with the Axis 212, that first modeling amp.
The Axis 212.
It was the big boxy thing with like all the buttons on it. And they hadn't quite refined the technology yet, but we all like instantly recognized that like, okay, this is the next big thing. Because it was the full guitar chain in a combo amp. And so after the NAMM show, the owner of SLM, Gene, he asked me like, can we do that? Could we like make something to compete with that? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, we could probably do that. And so we spent the next 2 years or 18 months, something like that, working on it. I mean, it was me and one other engineer. And we didn't know what Line 6 was doing, right?
Right.
And so I kind of had to invent my own way of modeling.
Of accomplishing this, yeah.
Yeah. And so we introduced that product. It was the Crate DX 212.
Right.
We introduced that. I don't remember if that was in. I think that was in '98.
Right.
Maybe. Could have been '99. And of course, like at the same NAMM show where we introduced this product, we find out that Line 6 got a patent issued on amp modeling, right? And so at first we're like, well, we weren't too worried about it because it's like, well, we don't know what you did. And once you read the patent, we're like, okay, well, we did it in a completely different way. But as it turned out, like their base claim, was essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, a digital guitar amplifier that emulates an analog guitar amplifier.
Oh, wow.
And contains an amplifier and a loudspeaker. So essentially a combo amp, a combo amp that digitally emulates an analog amp. Now you can see how this could be interpreted very broadly.
Oh, yeah.
And eventually, and so like I ended up leaving Crate later that year to move to California and work for QSC.
Right.
And I think they ended up coming out with another version of that amp like the following year, like a smaller, cheaper version or something.
Right.
And then I think they got slapped with like, a cease and desist from
Wow.
Line 6, and then they ended up stopped making it. I don't know if there was some kind of settlement or anything like that, but they basically had to discontinue that product line. So as far as I know, I actually designed the second modeling amp.
You
ever.
go, man.
But didn't last long.
Yeah.
Now, I'll admit this was that amp was kind of a flop, and there were being my first attempt at that, it wasn't great, but I did learn a lot from that experience.
Well, I'm sure it was frustrating too, because you're kind of trying to do the impossible with an impossibly small team.
Well, yeah, and Crate was notorious for hamstringing us, like not giving us a lot of resources, and having very short timelines on things.
Right.
And yeah, we did the best we could with what we had available.
Hey, it's more than I've never built a certainly never built a digital amplifier from the ground up. That's pretty amazing in my book.
Now, I will say, I learned a lot from that experience, and one of the conclusions that I arrived at is that I never really wanted to make another modeling amp after that. I always wanted to go back and make another guitar processor, but not a modeler, because
Right.
modeling is it's kind of a drag when you go through it. Like designing all the algorithms, that's great, but then going through and studying all the schematics for the amps that you want to model, and figuring out what all the subcircuits do, and then modeling that at the subcircuit level or at the component level is a very tedious process.
Again, it's translating things that don't necessarily translate.
Yeah.
I mean, how does a guitar sound versus how does a circuit work versus how does that happen digitally? Yeah, I feel your pain on that one.
It might be
three skill
easier
sets.
nowadays, because maybe you could train AI to just do that part for you or something. But in those days, it was just a lot of manual work. Trying to match that stuff, and then it wouldn't sound like it, like, because you'd have to compare it, and
Right.
this is where everybody else wants to get involved.
Yep.
A, B listening, and they're like, it doesn't sound like that. You need to do this, need to do that, and
Oh my goodness.
then you're trying to tweak it.
That must have been the most ungratifying job on the planet. Holy
at times,
cow.
like, look, it was great in some ways, and in other ways, it was ungratifying.
Well, it's creating the act of creation alone, designing something. I've kind of got to sit with you through it on this product that we've been working on here, and it can be very ungratifying because you're dealing with the obvious factors. Just getting a DSP chip to put in something and take out something. It may not seem that complicated. I don't know. It seems very complicated to me. Just the basics alone are hard enough.
Yeah.
But actually achieving something that sounds like something else, even coming close, would be a monumental, like, life-changing experience for a lot of people. It's and then when you get to the end of it, it's nothing but criticism. It can't be
Yeah.
not entertaining, I'm sure.
And the mindset at Crate was that they, even though, like, the engineers that work there, I feel like they were very innovative people,
Right.
but the company tended not to want to innovate, so they would look at what everybody else was doing and look at what products were successful, and then they would say, okay, make that but with one more knob, or something like that, right?
Right.
Make that but just cheaper. And so that kind of mindset did not appeal to me, because I wanted to actually innovate.
Right.
And I think that's why the idea of modeling doesn't appeal to me.
Right.
I'd rather innovate something new. But going back and talking about the Line 6 patent. So essentially they were claiming a digital guitar amplifier that emulates an analog guitar amplifier. And so, the word emulate in this context and at that time, like, could be interpreted very broadly.
Right.
I mean, you could interpret that as any digital guitar amp that remotely sounded like an analog guitar amp.
Yeah, in essence, they were patenting the idea of using digital to make a guitar amp. Really,
Right.
Yeah,
Right,
which is really broad.
right. And I think that,
And I'm not entirely sure that there wasn't prior art at that point. So
I always thought that could have been challenged, but the thing is, nobody really wants to
No
take
one
that
really cared
chance.
to at that point.
Yeah.
Probably.
And so I think that stymied a lot of progress in that area. And that's why Line 6 kind of just took over that market for like 10 years or something.
Yeah.
And because their patent was focused around emulation, they really had no incentive or very little incentive to develop anything new or different, right?
Right.
It was all about just let's just do more emulation, and the market.
Oh,
seemed
that's
to,
interesting. So not only did they have a patent, but it was kind of locking the industry
Yeah.
down and preventing the industry from going forward.
Yeah, I mean, depending on how you interpret the word emulate there, and the market. Look, the market received that idea well, and for whatever reason, they just decided to put all their resources into modeling instead of
Right.
trying to do anything new or different. And which is fine, like if that works well for them, but they've locked out the rest of the market, right? If somebody else wanted to come in and say, we don't want to try to imitate other amps, we want to make a DSP based guitar amp that just has its own unique sound.
Right.
Line 6 could potentially still say, well, that's still emulating an analog
Right.
guitar amp because it still like has distortion, and to an untrained ear they kind of sound the same.
Right.
So I think nobody else really wanted to touch that, right? So people
Well, who
just,
wants to get into a legal battle? You want
Well,
to
nobody
build
does. It's
products.
like-
yeah.
yeah, I mean there's no guarantee, like it's rare that people actually challenge a patent and take it to a point where the claim will get reversed.
Right.
Because of the time involved and the legal costs, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to
Right.
do it. So a lot of these things kind of like if there is an infringement suit, they just get settled out of court.
Yep.
But nobody wanted to take that chance.
Right.
Eventually, people in the market, a couple of players, they figured out like, well, we just don't put it into a combo amp, right? We'll put it in a rack unit
Right.
or a head, and then we can emulate other stuff.
Axe effects.
And yeah, I mean there was the Kemper stuff.
Kemper,
There was,
Axe effects. Well, there was Eventide. I thought did some stuff. The Ultra Harmonizer. It had-
does it have something in it?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you could make. Yeah. Vi used that for a while. Yeah.
Okay. But again, none of these were combo amps, which was
Right. They were all
in their
rack
base
units,
claim. That's
yeah.
kind of what they were relying on. And then at that point, the market was ready to more readily accept those things.
Right.
I think prior to that, combo amps kind of ruled, dominated the market.
Right.
But as things shifted more toward pedal boards and processing that were basically floor processors,
Right.
I think the market became more accepting of things that weren't combo amps.
Right.
And so that kind of left the door open for those people,
Yeah.
those other processors. But Line 6 had like a 10-year head start on
Right.
everybody. So I think that, if you're going to blame anybody for this, that's who I would blame is Line 6.
Yeah. That's an awfully broad and tough claim, and that's kind of sad. It's sad to hear that innovation stifled innovation,
Yeah.
but because it wasn't necessarily so much that they managed to get a patent. Like I said, the question is do you want to develop I mean, this is a problem for manufacturers. Actually, it's something we have to think about all the time. Every time we go to create a product, you can have a great idea, but the first question we have to ask ourselves is somebody that has a patent going to sue us? Is there a
Right.
prior, quote unquote, prior art, and is it patented? And we're actually kind of have already started developing a next generation product that I won't even talk about here. But one of our first questions was, is there a patent out on this, technology or
Yeah.
idea already? And sometimes, people are able to get by and do really broad patents, like that case where it's any digital and a guitar amplifier. And to your point, then okay, for 20 years now, nobody is gonna. So if you don't do anything with it, then the whole industry just can't,
Yeah.
because you could sue them for trying.
Yeah.
So it's the world is full of perils for manufacturers. I mean, especially in modern times. We have an incoming shipment right now, and the tariffs alone are more than my entire annual salary. I mean, there's so many pitfalls
Wow.
right now that for manufacturers, including this, that it's kind of I'm always a little amazed for the smaller manufacturers like us that you can stay alive at all. But without getting off on the subject of tariffs and politics,
Yeah.
but yeah, this is one of the biggest things that we have to worry about all the time, and a question we have to ask ourselves, because we've actually patented some of our own algorithms. In your case, and we've patented Pat's design for the solid state amplification, and it's the patent process itself is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
Incredibly
Oh, yeah.
time consuming. You have to actually get on a in our case, we had to get on a Zoom session with the patent examiner in Washington, D.C., who was quite skeptical about the claims, but
Wow.
at the end of it said, not only does a quilter amp do what a tube amp does, it does it better. It was nice.
Yeah. And it's no guarantee.
Yeah.
It's a deterrent mostly, because if someone does infringe on your technology, it's up to you to enforce it. Meaning you have to hire an attorney.
And that's after paying all the money for the patent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And also the maintenance fees, right? Because you have maintenance fees every 7 years.
Yep.
So it's expensive. And so look, if you're issued a patent, you deserve to have exclusive use of that technology.
Yeah, it's your idea. But when
But
you
it can
excessively broad patents,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
That's where, in essence, you've just locked down a whole portion of the industry, and now you don't have to innovate.
Yeah.
And
Now,
that's the point.
I should say, I will mention this Line 6 patent is expired. It's been expired for quite a few years now.
Yeah.
So anybody out there who wants to make a digital guitar amp combo,
You're
knock
all right.
yourself out. Of course, now everybody wants floorboard units. Right?
Exactly.
So it doesn't really matter.
Well, I mean, I still get the use of it. I understand, but yeah.
So, I guess my point here is that during that time period where they kind of locked out a large segment of the industry from doing DSP-based guitar amps, the industry kind of got stuck in this infinite loop of incrementally refining amp models, and that it's continued to this day.
Right.
And there's really I can't think of anybody who's making a DSP based guitar effects processor that is actually trying to do something new.
Right.
And maybe there is a small company out there trying to do it, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any. There's no major players that are really doing it that I know of.
At least it's been, in my opinion, it's been part of the. I point out to folks in our meetings they've spent undoubtedly billions of dollars marketing that this sounds exactly like your 1965 tube amp. I mean, it's kind of. There's this Marvel Universe scene where one superhero is flying at the supervillain, and the next scene it's three superheroes, and then the next scene 3 supervillains going the other way, and the next one there's a whole galaxy full of them going towards. Okay, I get it. There's this big, huge fight. That to me is the world of modeling marketing today. We have 70,000 IRs. We have 400,000 amp models, and I'm like, so.
That was a nice, deep, gravelly voice.
That was really good. But no, it's just it's a bunch of malarkey, So what? I'm referring back to Shania Twain here. It don't impress me much. Can I get the sound I want to get?
Yeah.
Can I do the things I want to do?
Yeah.
And That I think is the greater question. So it's kind of unfortunate in some respects that the industry's in this weird thing where they're clinging on to what exists, but that's where shaking up that paradigm is. And I'll admit it's scary. It's scary to do something different. It's scary to have a unique sound, because is anyone going to buy something new? Tom Schultz came along and revolutionized everything, but where's Rockman Industries now?
Yeah, I mean, it got bought up and then run into the ground.
Yeah,
because they just tried to cost optimize everything.
So how do you kind of create something sustainable? And and then there's we're really only looking at one aspect, which is just the quote unquote modeling of an amplifier. Then we have speakers, and we have all that sort of element to it, and all of these things have historically speaking have come together in a tube amp or whatever amp to create a certain specific sound. Pat, he's passionate about speakers. In fact, we're developing a new product. I'm going to make him come in here and talk about it too. Pat, you up for another Q show? But one of the things we're doing is trying to recreate a specific sound in a speaker. And in the world of digital, that's its own horrendous realm. Oh, I'm going to get myself in trouble here.
I mean, so yeah, I mean, we're an hour in, and I can keep going here.
Keep going.
Okay. I figure before we continue, should we maybe answer? There's a question in the chat.
All about worship guitar.
Yeah, asks.
Briefly ask, how does Tech 21 achieve analog modeling, and is that even modeling? No.
Yeah, I would not call that modeling. It's essentially like the kind of circuit you'd find in an overdrive pedal or a distortion pedal, combined with an analog cab sim.
Yeah.
And some EQ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And 99% of us won't know that what vintage amps sound like,
Yeah.
so it doesn't really. Agreed.
Yeah, totally agree.
There are so many, folks, myself included, and I've heard a lot of great amplifiers. I actually attend this event occasionally down in San Clemente, where Joe Bonamassa goes there sometimes, and the like, and we bring out all these really cool old instruments. In fact, last time I went, I have a photo of myself holding the very first Stratocaster. Well, okay, there's debate about it, but it's believed to be the very first Stratocaster ever made, which is kind of neat and everything. But I've seen a lot of amps. I haven't seen them all. I don't know what they sound like. And as Pat has said, history wrote out all the stinkers. For every good Tweed Deluxe that you find, there were 10 of them that probably weren't so good, and they hit the dumpster a long time ago,
Yeah.
So it's history wrote all those out.
Yeah.
So speakers.
Speakers. You brought up speakers, and that's actually the
now
next
I
thing
had to
want
go.
to talk about.
Nice segue.
So I have some opinions about IRs specifically and guitar speakers, and again, this might rub some people the wrong way. So I'm just warning you now. So to really understand my gripe with IRs, we got to first talk about what it is that they are recreating, which is the guitar speaker. Guitar speakers, like if you're just, we're not talking about the fact that it takes an electrical signal and converts it into acoustic sound pressure, right? Not talking about that. Just talking about what does it do to the tone of your amplifier.
Yep.
Okay. And in that sense, a guitar speaker it's just a flawed filter. Okay. It's, the reason that we have guitar speakers and emulate guitar speakers is you need something to kind of band limit the signal after it comes out of the preamplifier, especially something running through any kind of distortion circuit.
Right.
Because you've added a bunch of higher harmonics and even
by themselves they'll be a little overwhelming. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very thin and fizzy sounding. and you need to lop those off.
Right.
And also on the low end, there's a lot of rumble and stuff that needs to be lopped off. And so that's essentially what a guitar speaker's purpose is,
Right.
like in the filtering sense, is to limit those frequencies.
Yep.
But unfortunately, it does a lot of other stuff that you don't really want it to do and you may not be aware of. If you've ever looked at the frequency response of a typical guitar speaker, it's pretty ragged looking. I mean, there are a lot of little peaks and little dips.
Yep.
And I know somebody's going to say, well, that's what gives it its character. Now,
No.
no.
It's far more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the one thing I can say is typically there's a spike or not.
Well, there's typically a resonance,
audible resonance,
before
yeah.
it cuts off,
Right.
right? And that's not really what I'm talking about. What
Right.
I'm talking about is all the other stuff in
Right.
there. These are not like things that give the sound character. They're defects
Right.
in the response, and you don't want that there. So an IR is just going to duplicate that. Is going to replicate that faithfully. And so that's one of the problems I have with IRs. Continuing to talk about speakers, though. So a speaker, like if you're playing through, an amp and a speaker, you've got a speaker. And if you want to change that, you got to change your cab or change your speakers out. So it doesn't really give you a lot of versatility.
Right.
That's the other issue I have with speakers.
I mean, there's whole strings on our users group on Facebook that, where people talk endlessly about, I have this and I don't like the sound of it. What do you guys recommend? And also the other thing I can point out, like after years of long conversations with customers, the relationship between the guitar and the speaker is kind of one of the more important relationships that's out there. If you have something that is kind of spiky at 1.2K and you happen to have a speaker plugged in that's also spiky at 1.2K,
Yeah.
guess what's going to happen? All you're
Yeah.
going to hear is 1.2K when you play, and it's not going to be a pleasant sound.
Right.
And I've seen that kind of over and over again, or where one person is saying that a speaker is bright and the other person is saying, it's kind of dull. Well, it turns out your pickups and the sound of your guitar play a key role in that as well. And swapping out speakers may or may not get you what you really want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So ultimately, you want your speaker or your speaker emulation
Correct.
to band limit the signal, but otherwise it should sound transparent, right?
Right.
If you want to add character, meaning you want a bump somewhere in
Right.
the mids or highs or a cut somewhere, you do that with EQ, right? You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't rely on your speaker to do that. You want something that you have control over.
Right.
So, segueing into IRs, first let me sort of briefly explain what an IR is, like from a technical standpoint. Essentially what you're doing is you're measuring the impulse response of the loudspeaker and sampling it. Okay? The impulse response is just if you drive an impulse into that speaker,
Right.
what you get out is not going to be the impulse, it's going to be the actual impulse response of that speaker, which is what the speaker actually does
Right.
to the sound in the time domain.
By impulse, you just mean put a signal in?
It's a signal that is just a spike, like it's in the time domain. It's like tick.
Yeah.
And then what you get out is going to not be that tick. It's going to be that tick followed by a bunch of stuff, right? All
Right.
that stuff is what that speaker has done to that.
Right.
It's easier to think about this in the frequency domain, right? Because in the frequency domain, an impulse like that just looks like a flat line
Right.
in the frequency response. And then the speaker, its frequency response will have some curve, right? But
Right.
in the time domain, that produces the impulse response that you get out.
Gotcha. Which
So you just
I think you just answered someone's question.
So you're recording that and just sampling it.
Right.
And then to apply that to your guitar signal, you do what's called convolution to apply that to the signal. Now, for those of us who know DSP, that's like the simplest and most unimaginative thing that you could do. Like
Right.
a simple, and also in DSP, we don't call it an IR. We call this an FIR filter for
Right.
finite impulse response.
Got it.
Because there's also something called an infinite impulse response filter,
Right.
which is different. So again, here's where a marketing guy came in and said, we need to rename this for some reason. I don't know.
It's always the marketing
Yeah.
guys.
So it's kind of a lazy and unimaginative way to just reproduce the sound of a speaker,
Right.
which it does, right, for that specific point in front of the speaker. But if you really want to reproduce the sound of it,
Right.
you might want to take that measurement at a lot of places and then average those together in some way.
Well, and speakers sound different in real life depending on where you stand relative to them.
And where you position them, how close to a wall they are.
What size
And
cabinet they're in.
so
Is it
on and
closed
so
or open
forth.
back? Is there a slat on the cabinet?
And again, none of these are going to fix the inherent defects in the speaker.
Yeah.
It's just going to reproduce it.
And as Ezekiel Trifon says, there's mechanical inertia due to its mass, and the wood itself reverberates regardless of the room. And again, great point. It's even the wood is resonating.
So yes, an IR is a time domain filter. Well, I mean, as everything is.
Right.
And yeah, depending on the cabinet may contribute somewhat to what you hear, especially when you're talking about guitar speakers, because guitar speakers are not designed like hi-fi speakers.
Right.
And so you have more resonance, typically, because of the wood.
Right.
How much that contributes to the overall sound, it might contribute a little bit. The other thing is that with open back speakers function as a dipole.
Yep.
So you get sound coming out the back that is going to reflect off of walls and things.
Yep.
So the process of actually creating an IR can be somewhat problematic. If your intent is to reproduce the sound of that cabinet.
Right.
Because like you said, it depends on where you are relative
Yep.
to the cabinet and what room it's in.
On axis, off axis, how far away you are.
And depending on the
Yep.
type of cabinet, those factors can, be exaggerated.
And recording engineers know this. That's why they have so many different microphone styles and techniques for recordings in order to kind of get optimal results. I mean, in this case, one thing that could be pointed out is congrats on getting your impulse response absolutely correct, in capturing that. But look, folks, the 99% of the time, the sound that you're trying to achieve, you probably are trying to achieve a sound that was recorded with a specific microphone, with a, when I'm kind of in creating presets, that's one of the things that sometimes I would go try to take a look at, like, what was the gear used? How did they do it? And it would inform how I tried to address, creating a certain sound, right? After a while, I just let go of it because I realized it's not actually helping me.
Yeah.
To know that, and a big deal. I know they used a Rode condenser microphone, so.
Yeah. Because if you want to have the sound of a particular microphone,
Right.
I mean, ideally you would measure the IR with a reference mic,
Right.
and then calibrate for that, so that you're calibrating out the contribution of the microphone.
Right.
And then if you want the contribution of a microphone, you would convolve that with the IR itself. Which I'm assuming that people who make these IR packs, that's what they're doing.
Yeah,
They're not actually going through and creating 1,000 IRs by swapping out the mic every time.
I can't believe they would.
Right.
That would be a big, big job.
So there's another factor to consider, and that's the damping factor of the amplifier.
Right.
So the damping factor of the amplifier is going to affect the frequency response of the loudspeaker.
Right.
And essentially, it imposes a certain amount of the impedance curve on the response.
Right.
So the lower the damping factor, the more of the impedance curve gets imposed.
Right.
So, with your IRs, do you know like what kind of amplifier it was driven with when it was measured?
And there we go.
And if you do, then how do you have the impedance curve of that speaker that you can impose on that, and do you have the tools that you need to create that? It just seems like an overly complicated way to deal with this.
Yeah.
So
I can definitely agree with that. That it's just the thought of, it's exhausting to me just to think of trying to do one, impulse response for one speaker. It's an exhausting concept because there are so many gotchas, and it's the sheer number of gotchas that I don't think people consider.
So, my opinion is, why not just create a better filter to recreate the sound of a speaker cabinet, right? That you can adjust. Like if you want to adjust where the high frequency cuts off, where the low frequency cuts off, what the damping factor of your amplifier is.
Yeah.
Just dial those things in instead of, cycling through like hundreds of IRs to find one that sounds
like what you want. Why not just let you easily dial it in? I like this idea. I'm in.
Yeah. So that's why I have always had a problem with IRs and also the speakers, just because they're not perfect to start with.
Right.
So,
well, it's a truly imperfect science at best, and I think they made fun of me for saying it last time, but I'll say it again. If it's not the sound I want and all I have is this pack of IRs, what are you gonna do now?
yeah.
Tweak the EQ and hope for the best, So would it be better? Right. Would it be better to feel like you have something that's doing something exactly the way something was done in real life, or just have a better tool for dialing in the thing in the first place?
Right. You're starting with something that is transparent,
right?
And whatever you're adjusting on it is just adding or subtracting from that. But at least you know what you're starting with.
Exactly.
So, what is it we're trying to do differently? Like, we call this the anti-modeler. And I think it's become apparent by now what we mean by that is we're not trying to replicate things that have already been done. We're trying to do something unique and different. And you can take these tools, and if you want to try to imitate some of those familiar sounds that you've heard on albums, you can dial in things that are pretty close.
Oh, definitely.
Given the tool set.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that what's happening underneath is a simulation of products that you've heard or seen before.
In fact, you can achieve things that you haven't really seen and heard before.
So, the way I think about it is, like, I draw inspiration from a lot of the gear that's come before. Right? We grew up listening to this stuff. We have certain guitar tones that we like. I go and figure out, how did they get that sound? Like, what's the circuit doing? What is the amplifier doing to get that particular sound or feel?
Right.
And I draw inspiration from that, right? And try to recreate something similar when I create these algorithms.
Right.
But I'm not directly trying to just copy what they're doing. Like, it's, thinking about, just as one example, tube amps will clip asymmetrically.
Right.
And that adds a certain amount of even harmonics to the sound. And that's something that a lot of us, it sounds good to us, right?
Right.
So, when I create a wave shaping function, I make it asymmetric to do that. I'm not copying what a tube does. I'm just making it asymmetrical to add
Right.
even harmonics. But I'm creating a function that is easily implementable by the DSP, because trying to force fit that to fit a tube transfer function is actually a lot more difficult. Takes up a lot more resources.
Right.
Essentially, you're wasting a lot of resources
Right.
to hit an arbitrary target, when in the end, you just want something that's going to produce some even harmonics, have some dynamics to it. Those produce that same tone and feel, or similar tone and feel.
Right.
But you're not like brute force trying to match something else.
Yeah.
And so that's the approach that I take, right? I just building native algorithms for digital instead of blindly trying to copy some analog circuit.
Well, and I can say as a user, it's the cool factor about it, and I actually didn't realize it till we were having a conversation in one of the meetings, and I went, that might be why I like it so much, actually, because I'm
Right.
getting new sounds.
Right, it'll be subtly different
Yeah.
from the things that you've heard before.
Well, and it stands out better in the mix. It sounds a little warmer. It sounds sometimes I just want crispy and rip your ears off,
Right.
and shrill, and I can achieve that really easy. It's
I mean, and that
a
gets to the
cakewalk.
main point. It's if you're just constantly trying to get a better model of an amp, then there's a certain point at which we'll have a perfect model of that amp, and then what, right? I mean, you're assuming that that's the ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve. And I would say, no, I mean, we want to continuously improve. We want to create new algorithms, refine them,
Right.
learn from that, improve upon that, actually innovate,
Right.
and ultimately reach a point where we're getting sounds that people prefer to tube amps and solid state amps.
And why not?
And I've always felt like, we should have been there by now. Some people might say, hey, we are there. Like, there is stuff that they prefer, and that's great, if people feel that way.
Right.
But there are a lot of people who don't feel that way.
Sure.
And I've been doing this for 30 years, and 30 years ago or 25 years ago, I would have thought, heck, in 25 years, it will definitely be there. Like, everybody would be playing DSP amps because they'll be so much better.
What's weird is we keep trying to pack reality into a box
Yeah.
instead of just making something new in the box in the first place. Yeah. Much agreed. That and the other thing I can say is if you're after like the most perfect recreation of something, well, this stuff is out there already. You can just go buy the
Right.
original gear and just play that.
Yeah.
I mean, that actually you'll discover real quick that it doesn't sound exactly like the emulation or simulation that's going on in the box anyway. There's differences. When you play with an amp in a real room, it's very different than when you play any simulator. I will make that statement straight up. You can get close, but stick that amp in a room and you're going to have a tough time convincing certainly everyone that it's going to be the case. And it also depends, because remember, we're making these instruments, we're making the measurements utilizing tools that aren't a pick in my fingers and my ears listening to an amplifier in a room. We're taking a microphone and we're approximating that. And we can dial that in as well as we can, but I'll plug into both and play and immediately know that there's a difference. And sorry guys, it's a different set of tools. And although we're doing cool things, no question, there's cool stuff out there. It doesn't mean that it will be exactly the same. If your goal is to be exactly the same, just get the original gear.
Yeah.
There's nothing. I mean, as the fellow from Pink Floyd said, there's nothing like David Gilmour, nothing like leaning back into a wall of Marshalls and feeling the power come through.
Right. And look,
He's
I mean,
right.
I understand, like, some people are like, well, that piece of gear, vintage gear, whatever, is expensive or
Yep.
unobtainable now. And so, can't I just get a modeler that will
Approximate
simulate that?
Yeah.
And the answer is, look, there's a lot of companies that are working on that. Maybe their models they have now are good enough for you. Maybe they will be at some point in the future.
Yeah.
But there are other companies doing that, and we decided that we just want to do something
New.
different, right? Because we feel like there are customers out there who want something new and different.
Yeah.
And we want to satisfy those customers. But also, we're creative people. And, I look at this like, being an original artist versus playing in a tribute band.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with playing in a tribute band. But if you are a person who's creative and wants to write original music, you should be allowed to do that. And there's an audience out there who wants to hear you.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to do.
Yep. Well, and I have to say, for people who want to create inspiring new tones, you need inspiring new tools to do that.
Yeah. And because of the way we're doing it by writing native algorithms for DSP, we can do that. It's more efficient than just trying to force it to behave like something else.
Yeah.
In the end, that's going to create more value because you can do that more efficiently. It doesn't cost as much money because you don't have to throw as much processing horsepower at it.
Right.
And so in the end, you get a unit that's just more affordable. So it's accessible to more people.
Right. Well, and I mean, the other thing is just because you can throw more horsepower at it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to sound better. It just means it's going to sound, it just means that you're paying, actually, in a lot of cases, I'm willing to bet, people are paying excessively more than they need to achieve a tone they're trying to get. You will never peg out the core processors on your device trying to achieve the tone you're going to get, for the most part, ever. And so you're paying for a bunch of stuff that you're never going to use.
Yeah.
And you're paying a lot for it. It's some of that stuff out there is expensive, and I've still yet to. That's not true. I've talked to one person who actually does create presets for some of these complicated things, but for the most part, everyone, all the pros are like, nah, I just get somebody else to make all the presets for me. And I'm like, oh, I feel you. It's complicated. That was I have to say, my chief complaint over the years, whenever I was using quote unquote modelers, is the interface typically on the device. Forget it. There's just no way. So I would have to not only download it, but learn kind of a whole new convention of thinking in order to just get to the point where I'm trying to play something. To just get to first base, was such a leap that I had to really kind of ask myself, is this what I want to do with my time? I always use the example of 3.5 hours and I knew it was 3.5 hours because I looked at my watch and said, I've got 3.5 hours till I have to leave to go play a gig. And I just wanted to make the simplest of things. And I had not achieved it 3.5 hours later. It just, the frustration of paying $1,500 for something that 3.5 hours later, I still couldn't achieve the most basic of things with it. That was just palpable for me. And I know there's a lot of folks out there who've had that same frustration. And that's why to this day, when I'd be playing, I would see people all the time with pedal boards, huge pedal boards, exquisite, sometimes double and triple decker, and massive power supplies, and they were sometimes creative works of art. Why do people really want to keep holding on to pedals? Why is it? Because frankly, it's an enormous expense. I just recently, one major manufacturer of DSP had a competitor come into the market, and the day after the competitor comes in the market, they drop their price $200. Can you just imagine if you had bought it the week before? I'd be mad.
Yeah.
So you have a competitor, now you're going to drop the price. So you're basically telling me you were, taking me as a sucker the whole time when I bought it, the expense and all of all this stuff, plus the complication, plus you're having to pay people to make presets for you, because you don't understand enough about your own tone, with that device to achieve it. To me, has always been a case of it's just too complicated, and I relate to that completely. If I can give my 2 cents on it, because I've actually, I'm gonna throw it down there. I'm gonna make it my goal to actually get my album releasable by September 1st, so I can spring it on everybody and let you see what I actually did with this one device. It's kind of startling, actually. It surprised me. But I was telling Ryan, it was so easy to achieve what I wanted to achieve that instead of sitting here trying to dial in, it's got to sound exactly like, Billy Gibbons' Eliminator album. Well, now I know that would be a Rockman. But instead of trying to, wrap my head around getting this perfect setup or whatnot, just so I can feel better, I guess, I would just dial in the sound I wanted. And then I'd spend a half hour working on capturing that exact part. So I got so much further, so much faster, that I stayed in this kind of creative fast track. So instead of having to learn and work my way through and kind of reinvent the wheel, I could spend my time being creative, and that, to me, I would have paid double, to have something, what we're going to sell it for. I would have paid twice that to have that sort of creativity unleashed. I've never had it before, and the simplicity of that, it really does, in fact, it really does matter. So that's where I have to say, and I got all wax poetic, last time we were talking about this, but it's the opening up that creativity matters, and that, I think, is one of the biggest things lost today. The world is definitely full of, like I always call them the cross-armed, folks, guitarists out there doing this and that, and we've seen it all, and you've seen it all and you've heard it all. But at the end of the day, what do you want to do with your time? You want to make some cool new music? Do you want to just sit and practice? What is it you're really after? Ask yourself that at the end of the day. And then ask yourself, if I throw more dollars at it, is it going to give me the thing I want? And I think that, for me personally, I spent the majority of my life plugged into an amplifier, whether it be a tube amp or a Quilter amp, or whatever it may be. You plug in because you want to be inspired, because you want to practice, you want to rehearse, you want to go play live. And there's all sorts of gear to accomplish all sorts of things, again, part of gas. But I've never had one where I'm like, actually that would be it. That would be the first time I can say I would use that to go live. I would use that to record in the studio. I would use that to just sit and rehearse and play around with. In fact, I'm working up acoustic preset packs that we promised right now, and stunning myself again at how easy it is to do it. It's a little bit of a different way of thinking, but again, it's remarkably uncomplicated, and I guess that's it. It's remarkably uncomplicated is the most powerful part of what this is. So if you're just trying to achieve something that inspires you, you got all the toolkits you ever could need. It's funny that people will look at a picture of a piece of gear and make all sorts of presumptions about it. But I've used it, and I've actually, achieved quite a bit with it. And I have to say, it's remarkable how easy the thing is. Jeez. So I guess that, for me, sums it up. If what you're looking for is to actually play and enjoy, boy, do we got the thing for you.
Well, is there any more questions before we wrap this up?
If you have any more questions. If you're still with us at this point.
If you're still with us.
3 hours in.
Yeah.
I don't think we're that far yet. I'm looking.
We're hour and 40.
Hour 40. We set a new record today.
Yeah.
Well, gang, I think we're going to leave it at that. And thanks, everybody, for chiming in and participating. Thanks for coming along on the ride with us. And we will actually next week, I get to go on vacation after this. Woohoo! Going up to visit some relatives and going to go get a few days, really just a few days off more than anything. But So I think August 1st we'll actually have Ron Artis, who joined us in the studio when he was here in his Southern California part of his tour. We'll have some shorts that will pop out this next week. But August 1st, 9 a.m., we're going to premiere the conversation we had with him when he was in town. Oh, we got one more question.
Ezekiel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. The Neuron and Seraphim have never moved from my pedal board since I put them there. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad that...
I had those on mine, too. I feel you.
I'm glad that you've continued to use them all these years.
All righty, gang. Well, it's been good talking to you, but I guess we will, next live will be sometime August 8th, I think. But tune in next week for Ron Artis, and with that, I bid you adieu.
So far, so good. I found peace, loving on those who hate me. I found joy, raising babies with an angel on earth. I found worthless, saving dollars on a rock in space. I won't kill for gold.